Bermuda, the Isle of Devils, the still vexed Bermudians, where over 500 years of history are packed into merely 21 square miles. In the busyness of our modern lives, do we stop to think about how many generations of people must have passed down the very same lanes we walk now, or lived out their lives in the houses and land we now call our homes? And not everyone believes in ghosts, but there's no denying that in Bermuda, history follows us. That this beautiful island has witnessed the joys and sorrows of thousands of souls who now have passed from this world. Or have they? Do some souls remain tied to these isles, searching for something lost, retracing steps long washed away, seeking to warn the living? Many would dismiss such tales as fiction, the products of imaginations run amok. Perhaps they're right, but just maybe they're wrong. Let's visit with the keepers of Bermuda's strangest and most eerie tales, the storytellers who know that the dead have stories to share if you're willing or brave enough to listen.
We're in an old house called Orange Valley in Devonshire. This was built in 1802 by Captain William Cox, who was a sea captain. He died in this house in 1842. I happen to be the sixth generation of the same family to live in the house. My name is John Cox, and when you think of all the people that lived in this house and, of course, died here, you start to wonder whether some have stayed on as entities that cannot move on. And we're going to try and find out a little bit about who these people might have been today. I wonder whether you believe in ghosts, because I certainly do. If you lived in this house, you would. In fact, a lot of my friends who come here, they say two things about this house. The first thing they say is, John, we love your house, but we don't know how you live in it with those chairs. It's not a comfortable chair. And the other thing is, there are too many ghosts. How do you stay there? Well, I guess I'm just used to them. I have to say, we've had quite a few ghostly sightings here, mostly by a middle-aged woman. She was last seen in the late 90s. We had an architectural group at the house, and one of the students in the group got behind the rest of the tour. She came up to me a few minutes later, and I knew right away this woman has had a supernatural encounter. She said, John, I have to tell you this. I've encountered an apparition in your front hall. It's a woman. I said, what did she look like? She said, well, she had dark hair. It seemed to me her hair was in ringlets. And she had very dark eyes. And she was wearing a long dress, probably dark brown or black. I said, did she say anything to you? Well, she just beckoned. She wanted to speak, but she couldn't say anything. She just kept looking at me. She said something was disturbing her. So I got to wondering, well, who could this woman be? I said, do you know what age she might have been? She said, well, she looked about middle-aged, maybe 40. Well, I opened the family trunk. I got out the old records book, and I started to look through the family records. You can see it's written with very old pen. And at the very beginning, it talks about William Cox, who had this house built in 1802. He marries Mary Robinson on Saturday, the 16th of October, 1790. So that's before the house was even built. But while they were married, Captain Cox had this house built, they moved in. But the very sad thing is, now that was 1802, the sad thing is she produced several children who died in infancy. which was tragic. I mean, 1792, 94, 96, all these children dying. And then Captain Cox records, Mary Cox, my dearly beloved wife, departed this life the 2nd of April, 1806. Her age was 41 years and 5 months. So we got to thinking, this ghost, this apparition, could well have been Mary Robinson Cox. Her husband was away at sea when she died, so she could never say goodbye to him. There was never any closure for her. And so our feeling is that she still haunts this house. Now, another strange story about this area, and I have to say other people have seen her, but that was the most profound sighting, was that in 1998. But 2 years before that, I had a couple staying in the bedroom downstairs, which is right across from the hall. And it was a still late summer, it was September, it was a late summer night, it was very calm. They were reading this book. They were fascinated by it, and they were reading the entries in the book. And suddenly, the door here going into the drawing room, which is always wide open, shut, and it made quite a noise. It was like, well, Gail said to Bob, "Did you hear that, Bob? That sounded like the door going into the parlor." Bob said, "Gail, you go and look." So Gail got out of bed, came across. Sure enough, the door was shut. Well, she opened it wide up, looked in. There didn't seem to be anything strange in there. Crept back into bed. She said, "I don't know what's going on, Bob. I mean, there's no breeze. It's not John. He's up in his bed." Anyway, just a few minutes later, again, this door, which was wide open, went bang again. So again, Bob said to Gail, "Gail, you go and look. I can't go out there." So Gail got out of bed, came across the hall. Sure enough, the door was shut again. She opened it wide open. She said the whole room smelt of jasmine. She said, "I can't believe this." Well, anyway, she decided to shut the door and leave it shut. Went back to bed. They shut their door. They put earplugs in, and they went to sleep. And the next morning, they told me about it. This door was shut. I opened it. There was still a smell of jasmine in the room, but not as heavy as when Gail had been there. But this is an interesting concept that one often either sees a ghost or hears a ghost or smells like tobacco pipe is very common, jasmine, perfume. It's very unusual to encounter like 2 or 3 manifestations at once. So, you know, the woman who encountered Mary, she saw her but didn't hear her. Maybe we do hear her because we hear footsteps in the house at night sometimes, particularly on the stairs. My grandfather used to say, "Oh, well, you know, they creak when the humidity changes." But these are really profound, definite footsteps. They're not creaking floors. I know the difference because I've heard creaking floors. And they go up the stairs and back down the stairs. So there's a case of hearing perhaps Mary Cox as well. So that's the story to do with the front of the house, but we have more to tell. They get creepier as we go along. We're now in a bedroom of Orange Valley, and this room has had a sighting as recently as 5 to 7 years ago. My brother was sleeping in this room for a few months, and he had some very unusual encounters, and definitely of the supernatural kind. He'd always be awoken by the sound of footsteps. So they were sort of heavy footsteps around the room. And he would turn to face this side, and more often than not, he would encounter the apparition of a young black fellow wearing white. And I would ask Donald, you know, how old do you think this fellow is? And he said he looks around 18 or 20. he only appears to me for a few moments, and then he always just sort of fragments. And he said, there's always the nightlight on, so I know I'm not dreaming. I know I'm looking at an apparition. And every time this happens, when he does appear, sometimes I just hear the footsteps, but more often than not, he will then appear to me and stand right over my bed. And when he disappears, we smell bacon. The smell of cooking, he smells the smell of cooking bacon in the room. And this happens every time. So again, I reached into the trunk and I thought, well, let's see, who could this fellow be? I wonder if he might be recorded. Well, sure enough, Captain Cox recorded the lives and deaths of slaves that were at Orange Valley. There are quite a few births here of various slaves. If you heard anything, that was probably Mary. She does like to shut and open doors, as we know. They had a slave named Patience, who was born in 1808, Edward, Hannah, Thomas. But then I come to a fellow here named John Smith. John Smith was born at Orange Valley on May the 10th, 1815. He departed this life in December 1833. I thought, well, that would make him about 18 years old. There are two very sad components with this entry. First of all, he's only 18 when he dies. And I thought, I wonder if that's the fellow that my brother is seeing by the bed. And the other thing is that the death, December 1833. Most of us know that only months later, in August 1834, the slaves in Bermuda all were freed. So he would have been freed, and he died just before that, which is very sad. Although there's something rather heartwarming here. The very last entry in the book is for Thomas Lewis, the son of Charlotte Amanda, was born the 3rd of December, 1838. He was born free. Well, then I thought, well, why would this person be in a bedroom? I know this was a bedroom. When my great-grandfather lived here, it was a library. But lo and behold, my grandfather told me when I was doing the history of the house that in the very beginning of the history of this house, right up until 1853, and remember the house was built in 1802, this was the kitchen. There was a great big hearth right there in the wall, and all the cooking was done here. And then I thought, oh my goodness, the smell of bacon. If this was the kitchen, surely you would smell bacon and smell other things too, but my brother said it was always the smell of bacon. So it seems like not only does Mary lurk here, who died at 41, but also John Smith lingers here as a young ghost who dies at 18. As a child, I slept, or a young teenager, I slept in a bedroom right above this. And while I never saw a ghost up there, I had many encounters of footsteps. I was constantly touched, usually on my arms, sometimes on my neck. Objects would move around. I was told later by a psychic that I was probably experiencing a poltergeist. And young teenagers, I was about 14, they have so much energy that they can draw out ghosts that move things and walk around. But I never saw anything. But it disturbed me so much that I moved out of that room. And my parents said, please don't tell your youngest brother, because he's going to be taking over that room. Don't tell him. I never did. I never said a word. The third night that he was in that room, he came out and he said to my parents, I'm having a hard time. I'm hearing footsteps and I'm being touched and I'm seeing eerie lights. That was the other thing. We would see very strange lights darting around the room. I have to admit that some of my house guests I put in there, and they never stay more than 3 nights. Because always by the third night, they start having apparition sightings, and they are gone by the 4th day. They say house guests shouldn't really stay after 3 nights. So anyway, that's that story. But this story about John Smith, I think, is one of the most interesting and profound. And the fact that the sightings have been so recent. We just are amazed by this. We're now on the stairs of Orange Valley, and something very, very strange happened here just after Hurricane Emily in September of 1987. I know a lot of us remember Emily. A lot of us were without electricity for weeks. We were without electricity here for 3 weeks. And the only thing we would hear here is the grandfather clock ticking. No television, no radio, well, no internet in those days. But you didn't even hear the fridge buzzing. It was very, very quiet here. Well, we had electric range, and obviously it didn't work. So we were next door at my sister's having dinner. And we noticed that the 2 dogs that were left in the house were barking furiously. Something was wrong. So my brother-in-law and I came over to investigate, and we had torches. So we came through the house with torches. The dogs were right at our side. They were really distressed. Downstairs, everything seemed to be okay. Anyway, we started to come up the stairs, and right as I started coming up these stairs, all the hair at the back of my neck went up. It was really so creepy. Neil, my brother-in-law, and I got up to this area, and we started choking. Both of us could not breathe. There was something very strange going on, and definitely supernatural. And my brother-in-law is not prone to, he'll believe it if he sees it. Well, we couldn't see anything, but we were really clearly disturbed, and I just could not get my breath. Neither could he. But we kept going up the stairs, and we went to the bedrooms, and I was able to breathe again. And then when we got back to the stairs, again we started feeling choked, but not as much as we had coming up these stairs. I also should mention that we had a friend with us. He didn't share in the plight that we did. He had nothing affected him at all. And he looked at the 2 of us and he said, "What's going on?" And we just couldn't even speak. We were just choking so badly. So we just wonder what happened after Hurricane Emily, the fact that there was no electricity. Some entity came out. Unfortunately, the old family records book doesn't tell us that who this entity may have been. As I say, we couldn't see anything. It felt like a very strong presence. It didn't feel like the presence of Mary, which is kind of soft and beguiling. John Smith has never been encountered anywhere up other than that bedroom downstairs. So it was something more profound and more disturbing than that. We just don't know. We'll never know. I have to say that once the electricity came back in October of '87, since then we've never had a problem. I've never had a problem on these stairs. But my brother-in-law often talk about it, and it's interesting how you can conjure up what we felt and the plight that we went through that night. We can both, but we rarely talk about it, and it's something I rarely talk about on the house tours. I don't really like to scare people, but sometimes you have to tell the stories as they are, and this is something that happened, and we'll never forget it.
Stewart Hall was built between 1700 and 1705. It's one of the oldest properties in St. George's. Throughout its existence, it's been many things: a shop, a library, a private residence, a graveyard. About 20 years ago, there was an archaeological dig in the garden of Stewart Hall, and they found the skeletal remains of a young woman between the ages of 18 to 25. Mixed in with her bones, they found an artifact that dated to the 1650s. So she couldn't have been someone who lived in the house because the house wasn't built when she died. So the people who found her bones began to unravel the clues as to who this young woman might be. She was buried outside the cemetery, and she was buried with her body facing west, signs that the community that buried her didn't view her as a Christian. Her body was buried at a crossroads where this road and that one meet. And her head was twisted at such a gruesome angle that her chin was resting on her clavicle, a sign that her neck had been snapped. All of these things pointed to the fact that this woman had been executed for witchcraft. This is State House, the oldest building in Bermuda and one of the oldest stone buildings in the New World. The first floor was there by 1620. This was Bermuda's first House of Parliament and courthouse. And in the 1650s, this is where the witch trials were held. Between 1651 and 1655, when our population was 3,000 people, there were 12 accusations of witchcraft, 5 executions. And that young woman whose remains were found at Stewart Hall, she was among them. In fact, there was only one young woman executed for witchcraft who was between the ages of 18 to 25 in the 1650s. And so we know her whole story. And it began aboard a ship called the Mayflower. Not that one. A different one of the same name headed to Bermuda in December of 1654. On board were 2 indentured servants, Elizabeth and Jane. Elizabeth waved her hand over the compass and made the needle jump without touching it. They accused her of being a witch. Later, she claimed she'd hidden a magnet in her hand, but they didn't listen to that reasoning. And they accused Jane of being a witch simply because she was friends with Elizabeth. Jane said, "If I be a witch, let there be a sign." And a rat ran across her feet. Now, the ship was probably positively crawling with rats, but that one choosing to make itself known at that moment was definitely unfortunate timing for Jane. And so when they landed in Bermuda that fateful December, they were handed over to the governor's council for trial. And the trial, well, they appointed a jury of women to investigate Elizabeth and Jane's naked bodies for any marks. Elizabeth was found free of blemishes, but Jane had a sore in her mouth and a raised mole or a wart on her shoulder. They said that these are signs that the devil himself hath been feeding upon her. And so she was sentenced to be taken to the place of execution, Gallows Island, and hung by the neck till she be dead, 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 which was done accordingly on the 5th of January, 1655. Now, they say in this area that you can hear the ghostly wails of women screaming. So, although maybe we have forgotten about Jane and those women who were executed for witchcraft, I don't believe that they have forgotten.
There was once an old woman who lived in a wooden cottage near Shinbone Alley in St. George. She was called Auntie Witch because it was rumored she could see ghosts. The truth was, Auntie could see spirits because she was born with a coal, which she kept wrapped in fine silk and secured in a corked bottle hidden underneath her bed. Keeping the coal safe like this also mysteriously protected Auntie from drowning. So no matter how many times the witch hunters would throw her into the ducking stool, she always managed to float away unharmed. Eventually, the witch hunters gave up and left her in peace. This peace did not last long, since the children in the neighborhood began to take great sport in terrorizing poor old Auntie. They would throw stones at her wooden cottage until all her windows were broken into glassy crumbs. Auntie tried complaining to their parents, but they only laughed behind her back and did nothing. Unfortunately, these children, nor their parents, had realized the absolute danger their cruel disrespect had put them in. News began circling around that redhead and bloody bones, the dreadful monster, was on the prowl. The ghostly beast was known to capture naughty children and carry them off to a horrible, unknown place. Because it was invisible to everyone except its victims, there was only one person who could describe redhead and bloody bones, and that was old Joey Jones. When he first encountered the monster, he was a little boy full of devilment, but he managed to escape Redhead before it carried him off to its hellish lair. He recalled how one night he sneaked out of his house after dark to join 4 of his friends. Their main purpose was to have some fun terrorizing the neighborhood. But before they could decide on their first victim, a giant spectral skeleton caked in blood and rotting flesh jumped out of nowhere and grabbed all 5 of them in one terrifying swoop. Old Joey Jones does not recall how he managed to slip through those horrible, grasping claws, but he does remember, to this day, the piercing screams of his friends as they were carried away. The only evidence that Redhead and Bloody Bones had visited the island were the large bloody footprints in several of the parishes. People eventually forgot the incident until the brazen disrespect of the children harassing Auntie had caused the bloody tracks to appear again. Parents began barricading their houses long before dark, and no one dared go outside after sunset. The result was that Bermudians became so miserable that they began taking out their frustration on each other, bickering and fighting among themselves, trapped in their own homes. After weeks of this, when they could barely take it any longer, one by one, they sneaked sheepishly over to the old wooden cottage and begged old Auntie to do something about Redhead and Bloody Bones, hoping she would forget the many times they had tried to drown her or how they had allowed their children to treat her. Old Auntie didn't forget, but she wasn't one to hold a grudge. She did know of a way to destroy the dreadful monster, but in using the method, she would endanger her own life. The sea was ancient and powerful, and Auntie knew how to use that power to drown Redhead and Bloody Bones, but as the coal protected her, the evil spirit could steal it to protect itself. So Auntie had to be swift and cunning if she were to rid the island of the creature once and for all. One still evening, Auntie saw Redhead in her yard, hovering around her cedar tree. She could sense that it somehow knew of her plan and was waiting for darkness to slip into the old lady's house and steal her precious coal. When darkness did fall, a blanket of cloud began to slowly shroud the glistening moon. When this happened, Auntie could see Redhead more clearly, since the blood in its head and bones glowed brighter and brighter in the deepening darkness. When the moon was completely covered, Auntie knew it would pounce. She had to move quickly. She pulled off her woolen skirt and slipped into a thin cotton dress so light it felt as if she were of the air itself. Barefoot, she reached under her bed and carefully removed the coal. She wrapped the bottle in an old bandana, knotted the top into a handle, and slid it over her wrist. Wriggling her hand to make certain that the coal was secure, she tiptoed out of her back door and on towards St. Peter's graveyard. She arrived and quickly began to dig a hole next to a gravestone and was about to drop the bottle into the small pit when she began to hear the rattling of bones in the distance. It was Redhead and Bloody Bones. She could see the creature slowly rattling towards her, moving as if its joints had to connect together securely. Then, it began to move faster. Swiftly, Auntie ran out of the graveyard, clutching the coal on her wrist. Redhead and Bloody Bones was now in hot pursuit, slamming into the earth with every fearsome lunge. The faster Auntie ran, the quicker the gap between them seemed to narrow, but she was too afraid to check. When Redhead and Bloody Bones seemed a touching distance behind her, Auntie saw the north shore a few feet ahead. With one last push of her exhausted body, Auntie managed to plunge into the cooling waters below, certain that the monster would not follow her to its demise. However, she began to panic when she saw the bloody beast reach the edge of the ocean and with one mighty kick throw itself into the water towards her. When she saw that the water barely brushed the bottom of the skeleton's ribs, she quickly realized that although Redhead and Bloody Bones could not swim, it was tall enough to wade out for quite a distance. Auntie was now tired. The call felt heavy around her wrist. But in that moment, she decided to fight her fear and her fatigue and swim for her life. She could tell that Redhead and Bloody Bones was gaining on her because the waves from his giant steps made her rise and fall as the creature stamped towards her. The swells grew higher and higher as the creature stamped closer and closer until it was too close. "You won't get away from me," it growled, reaching out to grab her wrist. As it did, the sea sensed the imminent danger and swirled around Auntie's wrist, causing the bottle to fall out of the bandana and disappear below. At that moment, Auntie's load was lightened, and with all the strength she could find, she swam as fast as she could. Redhead and Bloody Bones tried to follow, but was soon out of its depth. To Auntie's great relief, she looked over her shoulder and saw the monster struggling to stay afloat. Redhead and Bloody Bones let out one last gruesome howl as its head disappeared beneath the blue waters, creating such a mighty wave that Auntie was being hurled far out to sea. But the ocean would not let this happen and gathered enough of itself around Auntie to carry her safely back to shore. As the story goes, old-time Bermudians believe that whenever the sun pops out of the ocean with a spectacular red glow, it's what remains of Redhead and Bloody Bones, safely out of reach.